chapter 22. 21 continues. This is a very famous line. Everyone knows this virtually. And this is often pointed to by those who are skeptical about the integrity of the biblical text as an indication of the brutality of these archaic societies, but it was actually a limit on violence rather than the reverse. We don't understand how violent these societies could be. Eye for eye, this is 21:24, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. 21:25 is burning for burning, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. An idea here is that the reprisal for mischief and damage should be proportionate, because it could be, well, you trip me and I kill you. Mm-hmm. And that seems disproportionate. But in societies that were run by an honor code, disproportionate retaliation was the norm, and that rapidly, frequently cycled out of control. And this is a limit on that. You're not entitled to more damage than has been visited upon you.
Is this specifically unpacking the previous law,
right?
Dennis,
but it happens,
or does it distill
yes, but
the
it also
whole
has it
logic
generally.
of proportionality?
It's not the only time that it's mentioned. You're entirely right, but it is not the only time eye for an eye is mentioned. So everything you said is critical. This was a major moral achievement, that an eye is only worth an eye, not a life or not two eyes. Mm-hmm. Also, mm-hmm. the eye of a poor man is no less valuable than the eye of a nobleman mm-hmm. or a king. Mm-hmm. This was a massive statement forward in history. And third, there is no example in the history of the Jewish people of somebody's eye being taken out if he took out somebody else's eye. It was always understood, except for the life part, it was always understood as monetary compensation. It is a statement of principle, however, that an eye is only worth an eye.
Mm-hmm. Right, so this is a limit, and it's not an injunction to vengeance, it's a limit.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and restricts the punishment to the individual, not the individual's family and tribe.
Right, exactly.
So
limitation in that regard too.
It contains the retribution.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And what do you make of the Christ statement, which he says if
you have heard it said.
Yeah, that if it's an eye for an eye, then we all end up, blind and toothless. And so how does forgiveness, in terms of the way the Christian take on this, like how does it play in this?
You're going to open that can of worms at the moment.
Well, we don't have to. Well, we don't have to.
That was it, the line of Gandhi's biographer, or he reports Gandhi as saying that an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind.
Yeah.
But I think that was just, according to Dennis, would simply be a mistaken, overly literalistic way of understanding the principle of proportionality.
A family for an eye leaves everyone dead, and society in tatters. An eye for an eye might leave everyone blind. But I would say, in answer to your question, it might be something like, well, imagine you were very sophisticated about being assaulted. You might say, well, is there any way that I could do good in this situation, despite the fact that I have in fact been wounded? And maybe that's tied into this notion of striving to love your enemy. If you're going to set the world right and you could bring even your enemy back into the path of proper being, is there a way that you could conduct yourself so that what you would do is entice him? I'll tell you a story that just popped into my mind. A woman told me this story when I was in Europe. She was in a city in the Middle East, a naive American tourist, and she was walking back to her encampment, and a man stopped and offered her a ride to the encampment, and foolishly she got in the car, and he took her out in the desert, and he told her that he had been terribly abused as a child and that he was going to rape her. And he took her into the desert and was preparing to do so, stripped her and laid her on the ground. And when he climbed on top of her, she took him in her arms and told him that she loved him. And he broke down and cried and stopped. And so that's a good example. Yeah, no kidding. No kidding. Because she got under him. In the psychological sense, right? She managed even in that moment of extremity to look past his his voluntary adoption of malevolence and evil, right? And to grab him by the heart and to pull him out of that abyss. And so
it wouldn't have worked with Hitler's or Stalin's torturers.
Hey,
it's critically that it's a great story. I almost cry listening to it. I've never heard it.
It's an amazing story.
But I'm not sure there's much to be extrapolated in the nature of human evil.
Well, it's always an open question, Dennis, because I think it depends to some degree on the canniness of the interlocutor. You know, I would say that if you're going to entice someone malevolent back onto the path of proper being, you have to be as canny in your good as they are in their evil. That's an echo of the notion that you should be as wise as a serpent, right? As harmless as a dove and as wise as a serpent. And I don't know what the limit to that is, because I've seen people in extreme situations walk the path so precisely that they could entice even someone hell-bent on malevolence out of that that insistence. I mean, I take your point. This is no simple matter, and it's nothing for the naive to attempt. But it's always an open question. You know, even when someone comes after you, how much of the outcome is in your control? And the answer is, to some degree, that's proportionate to the depth of your wisdom. So,
with the caveat that if you run across Adolf Hitler, it's probably a good idea to shoot him.
Well, and I would say maybe it's a good idea if you absolutely don't know something better to do. And it's not obvious, even in principle, what would be better to do in that situation. So,
he was two quick points. First of all, I'm not certain
but he wasn't that. He wasn't.
That it's true that eye for eye,
ending.
according to this, speaking as a Christian, Old Testament logic, leads to everyone blind. I mean, this is actually a way of trying to prevent everyone ending up blind, because it's setting the limits, as you're saying, but you set the limits also by being candid about what the cost is. And if there's no consequence to the cost that's proportionate, then you end up in a completely destabilized world.
True.
But even from the Christian standpoint, speaking as a Christian for the New Testament, there's no sense in the Christian tradition that kind of forgiveness obliterates the reality of the sin. Yeah. I mean, the whole tradition of confession within the Christian tradition, you can only receive you might say, the benefit of God's promise of forgiveness by owning up to what you have done. I mean, you have to name the sin and take responsibility for it. And so this logic of eye for eye is very much internalized to the whole possibility of forgiveness.
And sometimes it's the seriousness of the retribution and punishment that will bring home to the wrongdoer.
Yes.
The penitent wrongdoer.
That's precisely what leads you to weep when you acknowledge your sin.
Exactly.
Well, bring that home for today. In other words, the key, as you say, is proportionality. And here this is against an over-exaggeration. But we're in a culture, say, with prosecutors letting people off, and they're back out in the streets the next day, where the injured party feels there's no proportionality, there's no justice. You know,
that's also an incitement to vengeance on their part,
exactly,
and a placement of the moral burden back on their shoulders, which that's not a good idea for the stability of society.
There's lots of mitigations here, but you shouldn't miss the fact that this is a hard code, right? It's firm about justice, and that's for the reasons you just stated, right? I mean, first of all, whatever happens to somebody who perpetrates a crime these days is not going to happen for a long time. And that's, too bad. It should be clear.
That sends a signal. It sends a signal about how seriously or unseriously a society and its rulers take immorality and wrongdoing.
So it's also the case possibly that once everybody has accepted the eye for an eye limitation, you might be able to aim for a moral order that supersedes that, but not until that, right? So this might have been relevant for the time and place and a moral advance, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the ultimate moral advance in the realm of potential moral advances.
You can't transcend this without admitting it. I mean, we know this in our personal lives. If someone commits a wrong against you, you can't have any reconciliation without an acknowledgement of that wrong. I mean, that's the beginning of forgiveness and reconciliation.
Right.